Are jumping back into The Virtue of Selfishness, written by Ayn Rand. And today I thought we'd look at this concept that I think is very important. The namesake of the show is what is money? One of the immediate questions beneath that I think is even more confounding is what is value? Something that we all talk about a lot. We talk about the importance of it. We have personally held values. We try to create value in the world. We denominate economic value in money, and it's how we determine what enterprises are satisfying the wants of humans versus not. And it's something very closely related to action. So I'd like to just peer into Rand's mind about how she defines value. And I'll read just a small excerpt here to get us started. She writes that value is that which one acts to gain and or keep. The concept of value is not a primary. It presupposes an answer to the question of value to whom and for what. It presupposes an entity capable of acting to achieve a goal in the face of an alternative. Where no alternative exists, no goals and no values are possible. So this is something that's very important. Value seems to be that which guides human action, and human action is what we're dealing with in almost every circumstance of life.
Sure. So, value is that which one acts to gain or keep. So the values, in a sense, are human wants, are the wants of an individual, but not just a want, right? I can want a Ferrari. There's a big poster on my wall, but I never do anything to get one. I never try to get a job and try to make a lot of money and try to pursue that. Then it's not really a value. It's more of a fantasy. A value is something that I act to gain, or if I already have, that I act to preserve it, I act to keep it. Right? So your values manifest themselves through your actions, right? So I can if I observe Robert over a period of time, right, I'll be able to say, at least to some extent, what are your values? What do you think is important? What are you trying to attain? What are you trying to achieve? What's important to you through your actions, right? So that's how she's defining value. She's not saying here good values versus bad values, because there could be values that are destructive versus values that are productive. That is kind of another level, right? This is at a very basic level that all human beings act to gain or keep things. All human beings have values. And then we can talk about, well, which one of those values are good, which one of those values are bad. That is kind of a second level to the discussion.
Yeah. And there's in the Austrian economic literature, they talk about, this is the marginalism revolution in the mid 1800s, where they used to think value was objective. There was some elementary particle of util in the world, and this pencil had 70 utils and this wagon had 100, and somehow that caused them to develop a price. And then that was all thrown out, and we said, no, there are no cardinal or objective values. It's all preference, right? It's order of preferences.
Yeah, so this is where it gets complicated, because Ayn Rand believes in objective values, but her definition of objective is different than kind of the conventional view of objective. Objective in this context, it would be that which is appropriate to man. That is that which is appropriate to human beings. Objective Ayn Rand is not in the thing. That she calls intrinsic, and many people talk about intrinsic value, right? The thing has a value. We might not be able to, it has X amount, just like you said. It has a particular amount. And how do you discover that intrinsic value? Well, it might be through revelation. It might be through some math. It might be but it has a value in and of itself. The subjective view, and here, put aside a little bit the Austrians' use of the word subjective, because I think it's confusing. But the subjective view historically means whatever I feel like it. I feel like it's worth a lot, then it's worth a lot. I feel like it's worth a little, it's worth a little. So it's really primarily based on just emotion and whim and desire. Objective now means what this is worth to me in the context of my life, using my mind. So rational evaluation of what something is worth to me. And we know, for example, in the marketplace, there are people who buy and sell stuff on whim, on emotion. They don't usually survive for very long in the marketplace. They don't, but that is subjective. An objective participant in the marketplace tries, as Rand in the quote says, try to figure out what's important to him, to his life, what's objectively, that is in reality good for him. So for example, I might say cocaine is a value in a sense that some people want it, right? And are willing to pay for it. And it gives them a high and they want it. But I'd say that is subjective because nobody actually thinks about it. Nobody actually puts the time to really think about it, actually views cocaine as good for them, as something to be gained or kept. So cocaine as a value only to those who've given up on their mind. So an objective assessment would say, no, for human beings, cocaine is not a value. Even though that guy might pursue it, even though that might think it is, it's not really objectively a value. And in the sense that they kind of two meanings of value. One is whatever people want, complete free fall. And the other is whatever an objective value is, whatever people want, that is also appropriate, objectively appropriate, suited, consistent with reality.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So Rand is using the term intrinsic to indicate something that is intrinsic to the object, external. She's using objective to say what's in accordance with life or reason.
Exactly.
And subjective would be something more of just an immediate want of some kind.
Yeah, and the Austrians flip on this. I mean, Menger, the original Austrian, was very much, I think, had, when he talked about value, had very much Ayn Rand's perspective on value. Menger was the most Aristotelian of all the Austrians. Unfortunately, Mises is much more Kantian. But Menger was very Aristotelian. And he had this, when you read Menger, he has this view of value. And I think it's implicit in really the whole Austrian theory of economics. It's this idea of, it's not just whatever I feel like, whatever I want, but it is what actually helps me achieve my goals, the next value, the value higher up in the hierarchy of values, because values are on a hierarchy, the more important ones, the less important ones. So I don't think objectivism in Austrian economics, particularly as Austrian economics is understood by its founders, by, I'd say, Menger, von Barweg, and Mises, I don't think there's a fundamental contradiction between objectivism or conflict between objectivism and that version of Austrian economics.
Right. I actually agree with that, but I've identified something here that I think might be a circularity between the two, and I'd like to just try to parse it with you. So Rand is saying value is that which one acts to gain or keep. So in that definition, it seems like value is the aim of action. But as the Austrians describe, in my understanding, is that we all have this internal hierarchy of values. Whatever we're doing in a moment, whatever action we're taking is an expression of the highest value by definition. So it seems like Rand's definition is like value is what action's oriented toward. And perhaps the Austrian definition is all action is an expression of value. So I'm trying to understand the directionality of value and action here.
So this is where I think the Austrians are economists, and they're not philosophers. And this is why I always tell people when they read Human Action to skip the first 70 pages, the praxology part, because I think it's wrong. That view of the Austrians is that we have some implicit set of values and we just act on it. And Rand assumes that we have free will, that we have the ability to choose our values, to act on them, to change our values as we go along. But the rational person, the virtuous person, the good person, actually is conscious of his values, plans his values, and goes out and pursues those values. And we can identify those values by how they act, and the action is ultimately motivated by something that they want to achieve, and those are the values. Right? So it's not the Austrians have a little bit of this notion of action is the first thing. Action is the primary, and for Rand, thought is the primary, and so thinking and evaluating and choosing are the primaries, not acting. Acting is a consequence of all that.
That's really
think before you act, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a blurry domain for me because I'm thinking of, like, if you're engaged in sport or something like that, it's what is the old saying that you fall to the lowest rung of your training or something like that, you know? When
sure, because you've automatized certain actions,
yes.
right? So you drive a car, you're not conscious. I mean, I learned how to drive on a stick shift, right? You're not conscious of changing the gears. You just change the gears when it's appropriate because you've automatized that behavior. But note that you had to learn it. The same in sport, right? You hit a tennis ball in a particular way, but you've learned that. You've repeated it, and you've got muscle memory. You've got the connection between cognition and muscle. You don't think first and then act because you've already automatized it to such an extent. And yes, if once you've chosen, let's say, once you've chosen to pursue particular values and you found the methodology to do so, if you repeat that methodology often enough, it'll become second nature to you. And indeed, if you at some point decide, you know what, maybe that whole thing is wrong. Maybe I'm like you have to change your swing in tennis, right? It's really, really hard to redo it after you've automatized it. And what process do you have to do in order to change it? You have to think it through. Right. You have to rethink it and re-automatize it. So the thinking is always there. It's just a question of the thinking might have been that I did 5 years ago, and now I'm reaping the benefit from it. But to start a new process, you have to put in the work of actually working it out. It doesn't. Right. There's nothing programmed in us to just tell us how to do it right.
Right. Okay. So yeah, like, I mean, the old saying, can't teach an old dog new tricks kind of thing. Like, it's hard to do.
Although you can, but it's hard.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's hard.
And so with animals, and she gets into this a little bit, but I guess animals just have a lower resolution consciousness than humans do, because they have to learn things too, right? They have to learn how to walk and hunt and whatever, but they can't necessarily consciously reprogram themselves.
They can't at all. So they can learn certain things in some limited scope. Like, think about what human beings can learn. We can learn to go to the moon, right? Yeah. Dogs can't do that, but they can learn, this is a good guy, I don't like that guy, or that guy beat me last time, or whatever. They can learn simple ideas and they can hold them somehow in their mind, but they don't use concepts. They don't deal in abstractions. Right. So they've got low resolution is one way of thinking of it. But it's also, I think animals have a fundamentally different type of consciousness than human beings. And the difference is this issue of free will. Animals don't have free will. Animals, in a sense, are pre-programmed. And their programming, the higher up the animal gets, like ultimately chimpanzees or gorillas, the more options are pre-programmed in them. But they can't do the programming themselves. They can't change their mind, in a sense, and say, no, what I learned last week, that's no good. I'm going to. The only way that would change is if they had a new experience or something in the, it's they act more like a computer, more like what we call artificial intelligence than human beings. Human beings actually can program themselves, can learn, or, which is uniquely human, we can choose to ignore the programming. We can choose to be stupid. We can choose to commit suicide. We can choose to be irrational. We can choose to go on a bender. Animals can't make those choices that are self-destructive. Only human beings can make choices that are self-destructive.
So that's a very interesting line because with a human agent involved, they can retrain the dog or the monkey or whatever, but the
Yep.
monkey or the dog can't necessarily choose to retrain itself. But the human can also take that same approach to himself.
Yes.
So is that the dividing line? Is like the ability to step out of oneself, look at one's programming, and retool it? Because
That's one of the dividing
everything's
lines.
being programmed right through life, animals and humans.
Yeah.
But humans have this agency, I guess, to step out and
Humans have
reprogram themselves.
agency. That's a big part of it. But the other part of it, because they have agency, they also have the ability to have conceptual knowledge. They also have the ability to abstract.
Right.
And a dog might be able to differentiate between a chair and a sofa, right? He won't have a word for them, but he sees them as different, right? They have different sizes, they have different purposes. Maybe a table is better, a chair and a table. But a dog can't think in terms of furniture. Right? Think about furniture. Furniture is an abstraction. There's no such thing as furniture. You can't point at furniture. You can point at chairs and tables and couches and say a word that combines all these things is furniture. An animal can't do that. They can't rise above the perceptual level. They can't rise above what you can see. Right? So theoretically, you might have a name for everything they see, but they can't integrate those into a higher abstraction, into a greater level of abstraction. And that limits their ability to think, to reason, and to therefore invent things and produce things. And they're stuck. All they'll ever do is the same thing dogs have ever done, right? They're not going to, they're not going to suddenly just, invent a dog machine, because that requires abstract thinking, and that requires that self-programming, right? It requires agency. So animals don't have agency, and they don't have the ability to abstract.
It's really interesting. So the inability of animals to abstract is the dividing line between, well, as she says in here, experience gives you, I hope I'm using the right word here, percepts, but to abstract those percepts into a network of meaning that you can communicate and reconfigure is concepts. That's conceptual. And so that's related to the use of language, right? Because
that leads to the use of language. That's right. That's why human beings have language.
Which is worse. So is it we all have percepts, every sentient organism, but then because of language, we can abstract it, or
no, the abstraction, so once we abstract, we don't have anything to point at. So we have to capture that abstraction with something. That's a word, right? So we invent, in a sense, language to capture the abstraction.
Right.
Because there's no other way to capture it. So, imagine caveman, I don't know, whatever, hundreds of thousands of years ago, before they have language, they can point to certain things. They can even draw it in midair. But to actually get a word, that becomes necessary once we're talking about an abstraction. Or, for example, once we start planning long term, once I want to tell you, tomorrow we're going to do X. An animal can't say tomorrow we're going to do X. It can only live in the moment. But once you start planning for the future, you're starting to deal with abstractions. You have to have words in order to convey to yourself and to convey to others what you mean by those abstractions. That's when language develops. So language develops. We obviously have the capacity for language inside, in our neurons, but language develops in order to make abstractions possible. Abstractions are not possible without it, and language, of course, is not meaningful without abstractions. So they go hand in hand.
That's really, so the use of language or concepts is equivalent to the discovery of time in a way, right? That we can actually recognize our existence today and think about days ahead and accord our present actions to future situations where animals cannot. Animals are just living in percepts.
So think of time as another big abstraction, right? So what can we concretely know? What's happening right now? We can remember something happening in the past, but the idea of a past The idea of a relationship between a past and a present and a future, that's this amazing abstraction, that somebody discovered at some point and said, hey, we can connect this with a concept called time. And giving it a word, and that word facilitates communication. But that word, more importantly than communication, people overemphasize communication. The most important thing for words is our ability to think. That is, we think in words. So the most important purpose of words is, in a sense, to communicate with ourselves. It's to actually engage in cognition. And of course, the communication is good for that, because we can help each other engage in cognition, and we can support each other in cognition. But the fundamental is to be able to think. And that's what we need language for. We need language in order to think, because we can't hold the abstractions, because there's no picture that presents itself for time.
Right.
It has to be a story. Story requires concepts. Story requires words, right?